You fellas sure had me worried. I thought you wouldn't get here on time.
We've delivered 12 of these already today, mister. Where do you want it?
Right over there against that wall.
Okay.
That's fine. Thanks a lot.
That's okay, mister.
Is it? It's wonderful, Tommy. What is it? Radio. A radio? Uh-huh. Dad and I made it. Finished it last night. Does it work? Does it work? Of course it works. Brought in Denver last night just as plain. Denver? Sure. We had Schenectady and Pittsburgh, too, and Los Angeles. What's this? Selector. You turn them to bring in the station you want. Can you work it? Sure. Listen. Where's it coming from, Connie? I'm not sure. St. Louis, I think. Isn't it wonderful? Can't let it run too long. We're off the battery. Can I come over tonight and hear some more? Well, yeah, I guess so. Tommy, what makes it work, do you know? Sure. Simple. You sit down in that chair over there, and I'll sit over here. Now, when I say something to you like Sally Clayton lives next door, you'll hear me because my voice made sound waves. If you could see it, it would look something like this. Sally Clayton lives next door. The waves actually move to all parts of the room, like ripples in a pool. But you can think of the waves that reach your ear as being this way. Sally Clayton lives next door. In radio, a microphone hears the words. It makes an electrical current out of them. That current goes to a place called a transmitter, where it's made bigger and stronger. From the transmitter, it goes to a big aerial, which sends it through the air as radio waves. The The radio waves fly through the air, and some of them get picked up by my aerial and go into my radio. The receiver gives them to the speaker, which puts them back into sound again.
Tommy, you're wonderful. Where did you ever learn so much?
My dad told me that. Someday I'm going to know it for myself. There's really a lot more to it, you know.
Well, Mrs. Harvey, the honeymoon is over. Welcome to your new home. I hope everything is satisfactory.
Oh, it's just the way we've planned it. Tom,
What's the matter?
look.
Well, what do you know about that?
It's from Joe and Helen. Oh, Tommy, isn't it wonderful?
It sure is. Listen.
Tommy, remember the day you called me over to see the radio you and your dad built?
Yeah, what?
Oh, I don't know. I just thought about it. Remember, you said someday you'd know all about radio. Do you?
No, but I know more now than I did then.
Do you know why this radio's so much better than that one?
You really want to know?
Sure.
Remember how we sat on chairs across the room from each other? Well, here we go again. Remember I told you how sound creates waves, like when I say, Sally Clayton doesn't live next door anymore. Well, all sounds do exactly the same thing, but different sounds create a different number of waves in the same period of time. The number of waves, or cycles per second, is called frequency. Now, our ears can hear frequencies as low as about 20 cycles per second and as high as about 15,000 cycles per second. To give you something to compare it with, a violin makes sounds that run from 192 cycles to 13,500 cycles. A trumpet from 160 cycles to 9,500. A tuba from 45 to 6,000. Back in 1927, the transmitters and receivers could not handle more than this range, from 200 cycles to 2,500. But today, thanks to research by such firms as General Electric, the microphones will pick up and the receivers will reproduce as low as about 100 and as high as about 5,000 cycles. Now that extra range makes a big difference.
But if a violin has more than 13,000, what was it?
Cycles per second.
Uh-huh. And this radio only picks up to 5,000, it seems as if they still have a long way to go before music will really sound natural.
Oh, sure. Maybe someday they'll find the answer.
Meanwhile, I think it's wonderful as it is. What's that?
Oh, somebody dialing a telephone nearby. Just a little static. It'll go away.
But what causes it, Tommy?
Well, to understand that, you have to have some idea of what really happens when the sound waves picked up by the microphone are broadcast by the transmitter. As you know, broadcasting requires a microphone, which converts sound to electricity, a transmitter, which converts the electricity from the microphone into radio waves, and a broadcasting antenna, which sends those waves through the air. When there's no sound going into the microphone, The transmitter sends out an even radio wave, which is known as the carrier wave. The carrier wave can be represented this way. It has no sound of its own, and if your radio were tuned in on the carrier wave, you wouldn't hear anything. Now let's see what happens when sound is put into the microphone. All sounds vary in frequency and in amplitude or loudness. When this parade of sounds hits the microphone, the loud ones will hit it harder than the soft ones. The high notes will make the mechanism inside the microphone vibrate faster than the low notes. The current passing into the transmitter is an electrical reproduction of the sounds which strike the microphone. As each sound goes through the transmitter, you can imagine it being pushed out in proportion to its size. For example, if a little sound took 2,000 watts, a big one might take 10,000. As they go to the antenna, one can imagine it being a wavy line which varies in height. These waves modify the carrier wave, causing it to lose its even pattern. Now, it's varied up and down by the changes in power, so that it looks like this. You see, the distance between the waves, or frequency, doesn't change, but the height of the wave varies constantly, so that the outside edges form a wave of their own. It's this contour that your radio picks up and reproduces as sound. The outside edges of the modulated carrier wave is really all your radio is interested in. When the modulated wave goes into the receiver, the carrier is discarded, but the curve formed by the peaks and valleys goes on to the diaphragm of the speaker, which turns it into sound. You asked about static. Well, it works something like this. Some electrical equipment, lightning, and all the things that cause static actually give off an AM radio wave when they are in operation. The streetcar, for example, is a little broadcasting station sending out the same kind of wave as the radio station. Naturally, the receiver picks it up and reproduces it as sound. Another difficulty often encountered in AM radio is fading. You see, the broadcasting antenna sends out waves in all directions. The heaviside layer, an ionized region above the Earth, has the property of refracting AM broadcast waves back toward the Earth to a greater extent at night than during the day. The signal from the broadcast antenna moves out until it reaches this layer, which returns it to Earth again. When the sky wave and the ground wave arrive at the same time, the reception is normal. But when they do not arrive at the same time, as sometimes happens, the signal fades or is distorted. Meanwhile, other stations are broadcasting on the same frequency. In other words, they are using the same road. Even though they may be hundreds of miles away, their sky waves may reach your receiver. When they do come in under just the right conditions, your radio will pick them up and they cause interference. You can see how confused the picture gets when you realize that there are sometimes close to 100 stations operating on the same frequency. So even though the system of amplitude modulation does have its limitations, it still brings entertainment and enjoyment out of the air. And you can thank the research men of radio for the pleasure it brings you. May I have the pleasure of this dance, Mrs. Harvey?
I'd love it, Mr. Harvey.
Every year it's more fun to dance with you.
Oh, it's the music. You always were carried away by a waltz.
Sure, it's the music.
And the radio. It's just like being in the room with the orchestra. How in the world do they do it? If I sit down across the room, will you tell me?
Sure. Do you remember what I told you when we got our other radio?
Most of it, I think.
Okay, that was AM, or amplitude modulation, remember?
Mm-hmm.
Well, FM is an entirely different kind of radio broadcasting. It reproduces all the frequencies of all the instruments so that each tone is clear and lifelike. It eliminates static, fading, and interference. First, let's go back to the AM system, where you remember the carrier wave remained at the same height as long as no sound was going into the microphone. But when sound was introduced, the carrier wave became a series of peaks and valleys caused by the varying amounts of power or amplitude being put into the signal. Now, let's turn this into an FM system. With a modern microphone, transmitter, and antenna. The unmodulated carrier wave looks similar, but the distance between waves is shorter because they are broadcast at much higher carrier frequencies. Now, let's introduce sound into the microphone. Now the real difference between AM and FM becomes apparent. In FM, the height of the wave remains constant, but the distance between waves, or the frequency, varies with the sound, and the transmitter puts out full power all the time. So, in FM broadcasting, the strength of the signal and the height of the wave remains constant. Only the frequency changes. In AM, the strength of both the signal and the height of the wave vary. Now, what does this mean in terms of radio enjoyment? Well, let's see. You remember we accounted for the greater fidelity of our modern AM radio because of the fact that it reproduced sounds up to 5,000 cycles per second. But FM reproduces all sounds up to 15,000 cycles per second, which means you hear all the tones and overtones of musical instruments and voices. The result has been compared to hearing sound for the first time in natural color tones. Let's see what happens to static in the FM system. There's that streetcar again, and it creates an AM signal just as before. It is picked up by the antenna, but is rejected by the FM receiver because it's not an FM signal. And as for fading and interference between stations, the FM system takes care of that too. Where the AM wave was reflected by the heaviside layer, the FM wave passes right on through it. There is virtually no reflection or fading. Interference between stations is taken care of by the fact that the FM receiver picks up only the strongest signal that reaches it. The signals from distant stations on the same wavelength are not picked up. And that, my dear, is the best explanation I can give you of why your new GE FM radio is like nothing else you've ever heard.
Is that all there is to it?
Well, not quite. There's just one more point. You see, just because it's FM doesn't mean that it's perfect. When I bought this radio, I kept one thing in mind. The people who make the broadcasting equipment are certainly best qualified to make the receiving equipment. That's why I bought General Electric. GE helped pioneer FM radio and brought it from the experimental stage to the place where we can enjoy it. All the tones and overtones of every instrument in the orchestra will be reproduced by the FM receiver. In our living room, the brass passages will sound just the way they do in the studio, because with the FM system, it's no longer necessary to compensate in the control room for loud and soft passages in the musical score. In the AM system, the controls had to be constantly regulated so that this needle, which measures the loudness and softness of tone, never passed the halfway point. But with FM, it can go from one extreme to the other so that you hear the music just as the composers and directors intended. That's called dynamic range. And until you've heard FM, you can't appreciate what it means to listening enjoyment. Sally, I have the most wonderful radio in the world. And the most wonderful girl. Did I ever tell you?